Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and we have on the line today a special guest, Dr. Elias Axel Pedersen. And, we've had him on. I think this is going to be, somewhere close to 80-ish podcasts. And Elias, I think you've been on maybe 20 of them, I think, something like that.
I think as a guest, almost 20. And then kind of co-hosting, we've had maybe 10 guests, some of them 3 times. So
right.
I think I've co-hosted 20 plus.
That's fantastic. So, but I think it's important, people to know who you are. And so I want to just mention to people what, the kinds of things that you're doing. So Elias is not just a good friend, but he's a Swedish American pianist and has established himself as a formidable soloist, chamber musician, and pedagogue. He's a Mason Hamlin concert artist. He has garnered prizes on the national and international level and has been heard on national radio through KHFM and KUNM. Pedersen is a frequent performer, lecturer, masterclass teacher, and competition jury member throughout the United States, Canada, and Sweden. He's known for his conscientious, holistic approach, combining an extensive music theory and history background with his training in Alexander technique, which has produced many prize-winning students. Among other chamber music collaborations, Pedersen formed Duo Giocoso in 2008 with French violinist Roland Arnasalan, and Eterna Sirius in 2017 with pianist Jessica Yam. Pedersen champions contemporary composers, and he's got a list. Go check out the list of composers that he has worked with and has written music specifically for him. He's released 3 albums on Axel Records and has cultivated a loyal online following through his website and YouTube channel. And as everyone here knows, he also co-hosts the podcast And If Love Remains with yours truly. He is, in 2015, he founded the Southwest Piano Festival, a summer performance series dedicated to promoting the art of piano in New Mexico and local talent. In 2018, he became the program and competition director at Arizona Piano Institute, a Phoenix-based nonprofit organization whose mission enables preparatory and collegiate piano students to study with renowned international artists and faculty. And that is a wonderful, wonderful program. I've seen that in action. It's an incredible program for people who are able to participate. And I'd like it once again. Oh, he's also he's joined the faculties at Adamant Music School in Vermont and at the Arizona School for the Arts, as well as Rosie's House. He's the co-chair of the piano department. And I just, again, most of all, and most important to me, he's a good friend and he's a great, great co-host of And If Love Remains. And I'm excited to talk about the subject, which fits right into what we've been doing. So thank you very much, Elias, for being on the show.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I love coming back and being a guest now. I mean, we've had a lot of guests come and talk about various things. We had recently Mark Ainley back on, but not to talk about piano, but rather feng shui. So I hope everybody got to listen to that.
Oh, I hope so. That was a great conversation, and we've had some amazing guests and a lot of fun. But still to this day, one of the most popular episodes that I get is the 4-part series we did very, very early on.
Yeah, that's right.
And
we started out with that. That was the basis of my doctoral thesis or dissertation on Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. So we did a 4-part series on that. That was a lot of fun to do.
That was a lot of fun. It was great. And I hope people maybe will check that out. In fact, I got a great, in fact, my brother, I have to tell you, Elias, my brother contacted me. He's like, cause he played in the orchestra, he plays double bass.
Okay.
And he told me how he'd played that in a couple of orchestras. And so he was very excited to hear that history. And we get into a lot of interesting topics.
Oh, that's awesome.
So it was fun. I'm not sure if I mentioned that to you, but yeah,
I
it
don't
was,
remember that, but that's cool. I didn't realize he played bass. So
yeah, he
yeah, he
does.
probably played the Ravel orchestration of that piece.
I think you're right. I think he did. I think he mentioned that. By the way, who else did symphonic orchestrations of that?
So there, actually, Ravel was not the first. He was, I think, the fourth, if I remember from my research. It's been a long time since I
Right.
wrote that thesis. Oh gosh, oh my man, more than 10 years ago now. But yeah, there was a British conductor, Tuckwood, I think. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov did a version, though not complete. Um, there was a Russian guy, fairly, I mean, right after Mussorgsky, I think before Ravel. So I think there were two or three musicians before, and then since, Ashkenazi's done the version. Naumov did a version for piano and orchestra. Stokowski did a version for orchestra.
Oh,
So
that'd
yeah,
be kind of interesting. I was just thinking that that'd be interesting to hear like the concerto version of it.
yeah, I mean, the only one I've ever heard in concert is the Ravel orchestration. I've never heard any of the others in concert. I've only heard one or two of the others online, and some I've just never heard of before. I found them on, some rare old disc somewhere, and but still, it's hard
That's
to find
great.
some of it. Yeah.
Well, one of the things, and I wanted to have you on, because one of the things we discussed talking about
Mm-hmm.
is kind of the direction of piano today.
Mm-hmm.
We've had this conversation with several of our guests, and in the context of other topics, but I wanted to kind of hone in on where is the art of piano heading. Who are some of the players that have influenced today's players, and who are some of the
The
up
up
and
and coming,
comers
yeah,
that we need to kind of keep our eye on, and kind
yeah.
of what makes great piano art today. Because we, again, talking to Mark Ainley, that's it's interesting the evolution of piano. um
Hmm.
and so let's talk a little bit about that. Where maybe let's talk more broadly speaking, and talk about like the state of piano today.
Yeah, I think it's great first that we've had so many guests that have been able to talk about music in general, and we're mostly talking about Western classical, art music, but we've delved into some other genres as well. People that have gone into EDM, and electronic and jazz and folk, and of course classical draws from any and all of these and influences all of them as well to some extent. So there's a lot of crossover, but the piano is a relatively old instrument, but compared to many instruments, it's not that old at all. I mean, there are the guitar, and the kind of precursor to that is pretty ancient. Harps are, of course, there are pictures of harps in ancient Rome and Greece, but the piano as we know it today really developed in the 1700s, and those were the first pianos. When they were called pianofortes, they could play loud and soft, which kind of set them apart from the keyboard instruments of the time that could only play a certain dynamic level. Mostly harpsichords were available, clavichords, organs,
Right,
and if
very
anybody's
limited in their
interested,
dynamic range.
right, and I mean, organs could be manipulated a lot depending on the stops you used. Most of it depended on which church had which organ that you played in the 16 1700s. But along came Bartolomeo Cristofori in the late 1600s, and created this keyboard instrument, of course much different than the modern piano, but it could play louder and softer. So we got sort of this in betweener, forte piano, and that was sort of the norm for maybe 50 to 100 years until the Industrial Revolution really kicked in and took the piano to a whole different level until we just basically call it the piano today. And so it's developed a lot in the last 150 or maybe 200 years, but maybe hasn't changed all that much in the last 50 to 100 years. And that's part. We even see that in the repertoire. That we're playing most things from way back then. It's rare
Right.
to go to a concert now and hear a lot of contemporary music. There are pushes for it. There are niches that you see and hear, but the main concert halls, you're hearing big names play Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, the standards, if you will, the classical repertoire. And
Now, do you think that's because that's what the audience is demanding, or do you think that's because that's just that? I mean, I don't want to say that's the best music that was written,
mhm.
but over time, those have become classics for a reason.
Well, actually, a lot of what people don't realize is that there was tons more written in those days, and there are reasons that the music that we play, even from Beethoven's time or Bach's time, is what we play. There was a lot more music that was just filtered out. Now, some of that might have been better or just different, and there are political things and social pressures that might choose one or favor one over another. I mean,
Sure.
that happens today too, and that happens in the art world. I mean, look at who becomes famous in the art world. It's not always just based on how good one is or the craft. And we can
Yep.
get into that discussion too of what makes something good. And I hope we do. I know we touched on it a bit with Mark, and I know with Tom Rosencrantz we have, and what makes something great and long lasting. But yeah, I think these kind of masterworks or whatever came down for various reasons, and they became what people got used to. So it's a bit of coming from both sides. The audience members are wanting that, and so the people that are organizing the concerts give that to them, and it's very hard to push those boundaries. There are some organizations that try and promote more new music by new composers, but it's always a struggle. Every big orchestra is going to do a Beethoven symphony that season, and
Yeah.
they're not going to do a lot of new works. So it's
Well, and
always
I
a
think
struggle.
that's the other thing. It is. It's kind of like um, maybe a great band that's been playing for 40 years. Like people
Hmm.
want to hear the whole catalog, and yet
Hmm.
you only have a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Trying to, we all, that's the issue, is always trying within a limited space and time, like figure out what do we want to play. And everybody wants to hear so-and-so's version, of, a Beethoven sonata or
Hmm.
another person's version, and because number one, we can relate to it, but number two, we want to see what does that person do with it.
Right, right. The nice thing about hearing pieces that have been played so often is you can maybe hear a new interpretation of that piece. And
Yeah.
certainly I'll talk about that with some of the pianists we talk about today. Um, but yeah, a lot of more inventive organizations or soloists will try to mix and match. And I certainly in my programs, I try to do something that is old or established and known, but also mix it with a piece from a different or pieces from different eras, maybe lesser known composers that are
Yeah.
still old, or maybe a contemporary composer. I've done, as you mentioned, a lot of contemporary work. I don't consider myself a contemporary specialist per se. I think I try not to pigeonhole myself into any specialization because I like to play it all, really. But there are those that only do premieres and world premieres. And got a friend in Montreal. He has a group that's very avant garde, and they do concerts every year. And he might perform 20 new pieces in a year. I don't know the
Wow.
numbers now, but it's just a crazy amount of repertoire, and
And
it's
if
very
you
difficult.
and again, especially as things become more, it's not like the works that we already know and love are going away, and so again,
Mhm.
that space gets more and more crowded. But
Mhm.
maybe let's shift a little bit and talk, instead of like piano, but I want to talk about
Yeah, pianism and
pianicism,
how it's changed.
yeah,
Yeah.
the way that people play the piano, and the techniques, and like what are we seeing today versus maybe what we saw 50 or 60 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think that since the piano itself, the instrument hasn't changed much in the last 150 years, really since Liszt. The style of writing for that instrument, there are certain limitations or whatnot. Of course, there are some new pianos being made now. In fact, there was just one recently. I think I sent you a post. Some company has a new piano that has 108 keys.
Yeah, that Australian company,
The
I forget.
Australian piano.
Yeah.
It's crazy, but well, kind of interesting. So there are some new fandangled things and some that might take hold, but the general concept of having that metal plate, that cast iron plate, to hold a lot more tension and halls were getting bigger in the 1800s and early 1900s, and the instrument hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot since then. And so the technique for playing it has, not necessarily changed. If you say there's a sort of a good technique, I mean, it's built around the body. The body hasn't changed all that much either in the last 150 years or 100 years. So
Well, we've gotten
um,
bigger.
we've gotten a little bigger, yeah, at least in this country. So
Right.
I guess we can
We need larger
adjust things.
benches,
Yeah, it's funny,
softer
but
cushions.
right. What was it? I mean, if you look at late pictures of like Brahms or whatever, he's leaning back. There's actually one Professor Peter Shickley. He's a professor, and he's created this archetypal musician composer. I don't know if that's the right word, but Pdq Bach. I don't know if you've heard of
Oh, I
him.
love Pdq
Yeah,
Bach.
he's so funny, and so actually there's a biography of him, and Peter Shickley talks about. It's all fictitious. So if you don't
Yeah.
know about Pdq Bach, look it up. He's the
Oh, the
created,
Misa hilarious
imaginary.
is hilarious. You got to check
Yeah,
that out.
yeah, and so he talks about him getting so big that he couldn't reach the keyboard by the end of his life, and he had to write. He couldn't do the hand crossings anymore, but whatever. Anyway, yeah. So piano technique hasn't changed so much, but I think what has changed a lot since the advent of at least recordings and this sort of globalization that's taken place in the last 100 years, which has really some incredible advantages. And of course, the internet has just taken that to a new level. Great advantages, some maybe some disadvantages in a way. And one of the I'll say what it was like pre-internet days. You really had schools of piano playing. You had the French school, you had the Russian school, you had um, maybe a sort of Central European German-ish school, and maybe an American British school, but not that wasn't so strong per se. But you definitely had people or proponents from those different schools. Nowadays, it's really just one conglomerate. You don't have so much of a difference between a Russian pianist, let's say, and a French pianist or an American pianist. What matters more is maybe who they study with or where they went to school. I mean, there are plenty of Russian and Asian students, especially now at places like Juilliard and Eastman,
Right.
which are both in the United States. And so this sort of idea of a regional or a local way of piano playing or technique doesn't really exist anymore.
How
You
do you
still
feel
get
like
schools.
how do you
Go
feel
ahead,
about
sorry.
that? What is that like? I hate to get all like psychological, but it seems like we're missing something if we get rid of that.
We could be. I mean, I think things have been it's more homogeneous in a way. The piano has also become more streamlined. Steinway after World War II, because of which factories were bombed and which were saved. They ended up having a leg up on a lot of the competition because a lot of the big German and Austrian manufacturers were destroyed, whereas Steinway was going strong in the United States. So post World War II, Steinway basically just blew the competition out of the water and got all their pianos into concert halls, and things have been Steinwayified, if you will,
Yeah.
where a lot of the sound, a lot of the mechanism, whatever they have, kind of became the norm, and everything was compared to that. Now, some of that has broken down recently. Some companies have started to really thrive, and Yamaha is quite a big contender, and there are Yamaha schools, there are Kawai schools, things like
Right.
that. But still, in the classical world, at least in classical concert halls, Steinway is the most common. Now, if you go to all halls in the world, which include recording studios, jazz studios, rock studios, Yamaha is the most ubiquitous. I mean, they make far
For
more
sure.
pianos, and they have
Well,
a.
I've said, in my opinion, Yamaha is the best production piano. Like you could probably put your hands on.
It's a fantastic, and actually, they're very top end pianos that can compete, with anything. I think there are about 10 manufacturers in the world where their top ends. It's really
It's
it's
more about
nitpicky.
taste.
It's more about taste. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're all phenomenal pianos, and but they just make so many, and they make so many different instruments as well. So it's more
So
versatile.
so if
You
you're
could
a
be a Yamaha
player,
artist.
yeah, I was just gonna ask. So if you're a player, like, is it about like, and I don't want to oversimplify, but
Mhm.
is it about playing faster, better, more perfect? Like what are you competing with when if you're, um, as a pianist, a budding pianist, what are you looking to do?
Well, so that's another thing, along with the changes in the piano itself, or at least the streamlining of that recording has really affected the way that pianists play. And like I was saying before, you had these diverse regions that might play in a certain style, and now it's sort of a globalized style. It's really hard to play outside that norm or find your own voice, which is why when we listen to some old recordings, when Mark Ainley brings on some quartet, it sounds so interesting and foreign and sort of wrong because we're not taught to necessarily play like that with those kinds of freedoms. I think the digital age and the recording age really brought about an incredible wealth of opportunities where you could be in your living room and listen to a pianist that you otherwise never would have been able to hear. Even the greatest pianists of that day touring, they might not make it to everywhere. They're not going to, and so you might not ever see them in your lifetime. But you could sure buy a recording of them of theirs and listen to that. And so that was a great sort of democratization of the music and getting it to everybody. But as a result, then everybody bought that one recording of Horowitz or that one
Right.
recording of Rubinstein, and that was, that was a norm. That was the
And that
benchmark.
becomes the standard that everything else is compared to.
Yeah, yeah. So you're comparing to that. So that's one thing. I mean, recordings has changed pianism and all music for better or worse. There are advantages to it, of course. Nowadays, I tell my students that and I'm not that old, but when I was a student, if I wanted to listen to a recording or get an interpretation of a certain piece, first of all, it had to be available. If it was a standard, yes. If it was not so standard, it might not be available. Then I'd have to maybe go to the library and see if they had the CD or in some cases the LP,
Right.
and check it out or listen. Maybe only listen to it there because you're not allowed to take it out of the library. That
Yeah.
happened a lot when I was a student. Um, and yeah, and that's what you get to listen to. You hear it that one time, and maybe you don't hear it again. Whereas today, you go on YouTube and you can find anything, and you can have hundreds of versions of that thing, and the click of a button. It's so easy to find different interpretations and be influenced by them. So I often tell my students, yeah, it's right there for you. You can check, but maybe don't check right away. Maybe do a little bit of your own work. Learn the piece, learn the notes, learn the rhythms, get an idea of what the structure is. Once you've come to an idea of what it would be based on your musical knowledge and skills, then listen to some of the great artists that play it and see what they do differently
That
from you.
was that was an interesting, and I appreciate you bringing that up because that reminds me somebody else gave that same advice. One of our
I think
Dave
Daniel Shapiro talked
Daniel
about that.
Shapiro, yeah, it was he that said that he didn't want his students to listen until they've at least gotten a grasp of the piece. Um, and I think that's it seems counterintuitive because especially as a modern pianist who's used to having everything at their fingertips,
Mhm.
one would want to listen to it and try to gather what do you like and what don't you like, and think that would be an advantage. But I can see that not necessarily turning out as well as you might think.
Yeah, well, there has to be a balance. I mean, certainly when I was a student, undergrad, graduate, I was wanting to play pieces that I'd already heard before. It was rare that I would just say, "Oh, I want to play something I've never heard." We're drawn to certain pieces and we want to play them. So, but our teacher will theoretically know many more pieces and say, "Well, check this out. You might not know this piece. I think it would be a good match for you, and try it first, and then maybe listen to it or listen to it once, get the gist, and then work on it." So there's got to be a balance. I don't think you can just listen to the piece and try to copy everything on that without really internalizing it and learning it for yourself.
Okay.
So yeah, and depends on the age of the student, the level of the student, the independence of the student. If I have a young student that plays something, I might when we choose pieces, I always play through the piece so they at least get an idea of what it's supposed to sound like by the end. So they have a goal and that sounds great. Of course, they might never play it at that level or that tempo, but they've got some goal in mind.
Yeah.
So that motivates them.
What and as somebody who does master classes, does um specifically competition judging, how do you, when you're listening to a pianist, what are you listening for versus maybe when you're coming across somebody, you're listening to Daniel Shapiro, maybe you didn't know it was Daniel Shapiro, but you're
Mhm.
listening to somebody, or you go to see a concert. What are the things that you are more honed into, as when you're, I guess, listening critically?
Mhm. Well, it's I think this is goes to the crux of something that we talked about with Tom Rosencrantz as well, that having that knowledge going into a concert is a good thing usually, but sometimes not so much because it's very easy to judge. Most of the concerts I go to, I've heard the music before, and so I have sort of preconceived notions of what it's supposed to sound like, or how I would play it if I've played the piece, or if I've taught the piece, and that can be a dangerous thing, because if a pianist doesn't play it in the way that you're thinking it should be played, then it's easy to say, well, they're just bad, instead of maybe listening to it on the own merits that they've created, and
Right.
the different rubric, and say, okay, well, with those ideas, musical ideas in mind that they want to portray, it was good, or it was successful. It wasn't such a disaster. Um, that can be tricky. And so, of course, what I'm looking for, and I think what every pianist and teacher says that they're looking for, but maybe doesn't really walk the walk per se, is they want to listen for imagination and ingenuity, and this elusive term we say musicianship, which what does that mean?
Right.
Mostly taught tastes, and that depends on the culture that you've grown up in. But like I said before, we're such a globalized world that if you grew up in Siberia versus you grew up in New York City, 100 years ago, you might have very different views of music because you wouldn't even hear the same music. But nowadays, that Russian pianist from Siberia could be studying alongside the student from New York in the same school with the same teacher. So they have very similar experiences. But um, also, competition playing, I feel, is uh, that's a big topic. It's good. It's very good. The competition level has gotten so high. Of course, I haven't judged the big international competitions. I've judged on the national level, and I've partaken in as a contestant, in national and international competitions, though not the largest ones. I did audition for Sydney. Sydney is one of the
Wow.
Big
Yeah, that's a
10 or
big
Big
one.
15, and but the levels of those are so high, and there's so many as well now. If you look back 100 years ago, or even 60 years ago, there were maybe half a dozen, maybe 10 international competitions, big international competitions that you could do. And basically, if you won one of those, your career was set the rest of your life. You just need, and now there are competition winners that are winning multiple competitions, that are entering multiple big competitions and getting prizes. And it's just there are so many other people that are also winning competitions that it's hard to make a name for yourself. And there are those that don't win the competitions that still make a big name. One person that comes to mind is Ivo Pogorelic, who back in the 70s was winning some small things, and he entered the Chopin competition in 1980, I want to say, and he was eliminated in the I think in the semifinal round. It was a big sort of scandal, and Martha Argerich, who was the jury member, one of the jury members, walked out.
Oh, wow.
She didn't like that. She wanted to support him, thought he was the greatest. It turns out that the winner of that competition is an equally phenomenal pianist, and I do want to talk about him a bit. Dong Tai Sun, whose his career has gone like on a meteoric, I guess, path recently. But he's a phenomenal pianist, and he was a very deserving winner. And so I think I don't want the fact that Ivo Pogorelic was eliminated to detract from Dang Tai Sun's win. He was great, but also Ivo Pogorelic ended up developing a huge career, probably the biggest of anybody from that year, in fact, and one of the largest ever, as is just phenomenal pianist. And he is. Recent years, he's gotten a little bit, I would say, crazy in his interpretations, but I'll always respect him as a great musician and pianist.
Well,
But that
by
just
the way,
shows you that.
that's the other thing when it comes to interpretation, because like any art, I mean, at some point when you have so many competitions, you have so many really phenomenally technically great pianists.
Mhm,
Like, what do you do to set yourself apart?
mhm. Yeah, the level now, everybody plays so cleanly, and it's interesting you say technique. I think this is a word that's often abused or used incorrectly. And people think of it like, oh, well, he can play fast. That's technique. Or what I would call finger dexterity
Right.
is technique. But actually, I think technique is much more all encompassing. And so when I refer to somebody as having a great technique or a great command, I think of their ability to command and control the sound and the pedaling and the voicing and all these things that are just beyond simple finger dexterity. Because there are always going to be people that can play louder and faster in a way, and they're
Right.
not always the greatest artists out there. They might win some things, they're going to be the fastest race horses, and often the top competitors at competitions are panned because they're just seen as, well, they were technically proficient, but where's the inspiration kind of thing. And I think it's unfair sometimes because there are some great people, winners out there, and the same teachers, the same tried and true jury members that want to promote this sort of artistic sensibility are the ones that are choosing those same war horses or race horses, I should say, to
Right.
win the
So
competition. So
it's
it's
like it's this echo chamber that starts,
yeah,
kind of happening.
yeah, you kind of get what you reap what you sow, and I feel that a lot of the teaching today, we've talked about this a little bit before, is holding on to some old things, which is good, some tradition, but they're not being flexible enough and allowing for new growth or new development, and they don't have to. They've become established in an era that you could become more easily established. They've got some great students coming to them. They don't really need to do much past that or beyond that. And I think some of the greatest teachers out there are the ones that are like in that second tier, where they're not the big names, they're not getting the greatest students, but they're making something with the students
Yeah.
they've got.
I
So
was
they're
I was thinking about Thomas Rosencrantz, who when we talked and he does a lot of mentoring and teaching
mhm,
at a conservatory. And one of the things he said is the young students today, maybe for the first time in history, are the ones that are more conservative, are the ones that are
mhm,
afraid of taking big risks.
mhm,
And I find that extremely interesting.
yeah. So I think we've gotten to a point in the piano world, and it goes up and down. There's like a roller coaster; it waxes and wanes. But things have become so uh, recordings are so ubiquitous, and it's so easy to see the competition winners that there's this pressure to play so cleanly as the ultimate goal. And even in my own playing, I mean, it's a brutal pressure, and especially as I've gotten older, the expectations are higher. That you have to play so cleanly, and the amount that you have in reserve for making some artistic expression is not very much, and it's not always celebrated. So yeah, it's hard. It's a very tough world, I think, now to be a concert pianist, which is almost an anachronism today compared to what it was 50 years ago. And couple that with in some ways, dwindling audiences, which doesn't have to be the case. And I could go on about that, but and that music isn't as much a part of our culture, or at least I should say, this kind of music isn't. We are developing more and more music. I mean, it's part of everybody's life, but it's more bite size. It's more it's more gratifying in the short term.
Well, and I'm
It's more
just thinking about
produced.
I'm just thinking about this offhand and kind of what you're talking about, especially I'll just say here in the United States where competition is a big thing. Um,
Hmm.
it's the what am I trying to say?
Hmm.
When you see artists as athletes,
Hmm.
um, that I think that changes the relationship between what your expectation of what you want to hear, um, you know, versus, if you see them as artists. I like
Mm,
there's a difference. There's a difference between,
yeah,
as you mentioned, a racehorse, you know, and a prancing, perfect prancing pony. They're both
yeah,
extremely difficult and hard. But they're serving two completely different purposes,
hmm
and it's easy to mix those two up.
yeah. And I think the best musicians today can combine the two, but it's tough. And so, what I thought we'd maybe do, I mean, we're talking about sort of the development of pianism. I'll talk about two paradigms that I think have come down, and
Okay.
how I
Yeah.
think that there's maybe some light or some hope right now. Because I know when we talked to Mark most recently, it was more about uh,
The good old days.
yeah, the good old days, and what's going on now is sort of just a shadow of that. But I think there's some, but he admitted to there some shadows
Oh, he
of
definitely
light,
did. Yeah.
or some beams of light coming through the shadows. So I think the two paradigms really are this idea of cleanliness, precision, maybe attention to the score in a very literalistic or literal sense or way. And I think that's brought on by recording is a big part of it. But also I think there are a couple pianists, one I'll draw in, or I'll talk about in particular, that took us down this path for better or ill. And I think he's one of actually my favorite pianists, and that's Arturo Benedetto Michelangeli. And he's such an amazing pianist. I mean, he is considered one of the greats of the 20th century. He's in that Phillips collection and everything. And he's a phenomenal pianist, a very elusive character. Canceled a lot of concerts. It was hard to pin down, and every concert that he played was meticulously crafted and perfect. He actually turns out to be my teacher's teacher as well. So
No
my
way.
teacher studied with him for a
So,
little while, and
so
he
you're like
was
his grandfather
like
teacher,
his grand student. Although
grandson. Yeah,
I
grandson.
don't put too much into that, because I know a lot of people now love to just draw their lineages, like, oh well, I'm the great 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 grand student of Beethoven. It's like, well,
Right.
we all are,
We
you know,
all are.
we all are. So that doesn't say much about you, but maybe one or two teachers back that could have an influence. And certainly with me, I studied Debussy, a few pieces of Debussy with my teacher, and my teacher happened to study those pieces with Michelangelo when he was recording them. So I got a
Oh,
lot
okay.
of secondhand knowledge from those recordings of how he worked on it. And so that I consider very valuable.
And by the way,
But
and I hate to say close because that's kind of close, like you said,
mhm.
secondhand. Like, how does that influence how you perform and play them?
Oh well, certainly if I have one idea of this piece or a conception of it, and then my teacher says, well, this was how Michelangelo might have performed it, or what he worked on. And Michelangelo, let's see, would he have known? I should have looked this up before we did the podcast. If he had known Debussy or people that played for Debussy.
Okay.
But certainly my teacher, Paul Stewart, who I'll talk about as well, he played for a fellow named Vlad Perlmutter. And Perlmutter knew Ravel. They were friends. And
Okay.
he actually, I think one or two pieces of Ravel's were written for Perlmutter. So in one or two of the pieces, my teacher said, "Oh yeah, I played this piece for Perlmutter," and I said that there's actually this note here that's missing, and oh, this is supposed to be phrased this way because Ravel told him. That makes a big difference in how
Oh
I
yeah.
would play the piece, because I might not have known that or thought of that or assumed that. So yeah, those direct links can help a lot and change your interpretation. So with that, so with Michelangelo, I mean, he was so perfect, and I think everybody saw that, and it changed pianism a bit, and people thought, okay, we've got to play like that. And on the other side, not necessarily another pianist, but there are others that maybe weren't such the clean freaks, the OCD types, and they were much more free with their art. And not to say that he was cold, by the way. And this is what a lot of people pianists like Michelangelo or violinists like Heifetz, they were so perfect and so pristine in their playing that critics thought that they were cold, and they weren't cold at all. They just were very, exacting. But they had really good class and taste in their playing. So anyway, I think that kind of coming down, that really perfect way of playing, and then this other sort of artistic, very flamboyant, maybe freestyle in like a Cortot or something like that.
Right.
Those dualities, or a Cifra who is very just improvisatory and miss notes, but even Horowitz missed tons of notes in recordings and in concerts. But who cares? Who's the most famous pianist ever?
Right.
Probably Horowitz, at least in our day. Maybe Franz Liszt, or Beethoven in a way, but we don't have recordings of them, so
Right.
we don't really know how they played.
I mean, yeah,
But
absolutely, certainly the most famous recorded pianist of all time is Horowitz. There's no doubt.
yeah, I think if you ask my grandparents, things have obviously changed a lot. But if you asked a typical person back then, a non-musician, they would know two names probably: Horowitz and Van Cliburn. And Van Cliburn, because he won the Tchaikovsky competition in '58, and that was the height of the Cold War with Russia. And here, this lanky Texan, 6'4", wins this competition. He's sort of the darling of everybody there, and brings the two countries a little bit closer together. And that was a huge feat. In fact, he was given a ticker tape parade in New York City. I think the only classical musician to ever have a ticker tape parade in his honor. So he was a national hero,
Yeah.
essentially. This classical pianist, that just wouldn't happen today. It just wouldn't make sense to
What
anybody.
what I mean, Horowitz and Van Cliver. What was it about those two that set them apart and made them so iconic in the work? Because they're I mean they're more than just piano stars. I mean
Mhm.
they were cultural icons.
Well, I think Van Cliburn, it's easier. I actually love Van Cliburn, though some people might say he's not quite the level of a greatest ever. But I really love his playing. I think it's very sincere, very heartfelt. He certainly had a command, but he was he was at the right place at the right time, and he was at this cultural crossroads, and represented something so much for when wars are fought in the world, it's really over ideas, and who has a better idea, and who's better. And art is one of those things. Art is like the pinnacle of humanism, or human ideals and thought. And high art, something like this, where you're honing your skills to such a high level and honing your craft, it's that's a representation of your culture in a way. And so, actually, Russia was hoping to have one of their pianists win, and prove to the West that communism was triumphant because of their winner. And how it turned out was that Van Cliburn won. And the jury of the competition actually had to ask Khrushchev. So the main jury, head of the jury, was Emil Gilels, and one of the great pianists of the 20th century. And he had to ask Khrushchev, the of Russia, like, are we allowed to give first prize to this American? I don't want to have the Gulag. I don't want to have the
Right.
KGB come to my doorstep tomorrow because he got first prize. It's like, no, it's okay. He deserves, if he deserves it. He deserves it.
Yeah.
And actually brought the countries closer, and I think was one of the small parts in breaking down barriers. So, I mean, music is a huge cultural influence, and can help on the political spectrum too.
And then
So,
what about Horowitz? I mean, what
and
was it about
Horowitz,
him?
yeah, and I would say also one of the other big names of that time was probably Rubinstein. So
Sure. Yeah.
those two are kind of a little bit opposite each other, but Horowitz was just so electrifying when he played, and he had such magnetism when he played, and of course he had sort of dazzling fingers, and he made transcriptions. Of course, that's something that's sort of a lost art. Not many pianists do that today, but he would take opera themes like Carmen and make a piano transcription from that. Um, just a vast repertoire, incredible way of playing things, a very new way, a very singing way, um, incredible command of sound, and colors and pedal and all that, but just so magnetic. When you're at a party or something, or a group, and somebody walks in the room and everybody just stares. And they don't have to be the tallest, or the biggest, or the most beautiful, or the whatever. It's just there's some magnetism about them.
Right. That
Well,
charisma. That
Horowitz, yeah, Horowitz had that in spades. And when he played, you were just drawn to that. and he had such a personality, which partly hurt him. I mean, he was so eccentric in some
Mm.
ways. He quit the concert stage for 12 years. He just couldn't perform. He had incredible nerves, and very very self critical, as all artists are, but really self critical, and couldn't always deal with some of the pressures.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, he's one of my favorites. And even now, I listen to him with certain pieces that now I've played, and I think, gosh, is that what I remember when I was a kid? He does all these things wrong, but it's not about wrong. It's great. It's still great. So
And so moving forward, it sounds, it's funny because people they'll say, um, yeah, Beethoven and then Czerny and then like you have this like
Liszt, yeah,
line of
yeah.
piano.
This lineage goes
Right.
down.
But and so, I don't necessarily want to go lineage way, but there's definitely those influences, and I'm curious,
Hmm.
like who who today is who today maybe represents some of those ideals that maybe the being perfect, being artistic, being charismatic. Like what are you what are you seeing today in today's pianists?
Yeah, well, in preparation for this, and we're getting into that now, I made a huge list and I kept adding to it because at first I thought, let's just make a
Yeah, it's a
list
big
of,
list.
yeah, of like five pianists up and coming, under 25. And then I got to a couple, I was like, well, they're 28 and they're amazing and people might not know that name. And then I got into older people and I thought, well, they're performing. Maybe people don't know that name. So my goal was to make a list of pianists that might not be on the fronts of people's mind,
That's good. Yeah.
and so that they can listen to them. Now, I will make a couple disclaimers. One is that this whole list, and maybe we can put the list in liner notes. I'm not sure, but the list that I came up with, of course, there are many pianists missing
Right.
from the list, and I'm sure if somebody's listening who's a diehard fan of, I don't know, Jane Smith, will say, "Well, why didn't you put Jane Smith in there? She's the best pianist I've ever heard." Okay, well,
Right.
that's fine, maybe, but these are the ones I chose
Yeah.
at this moment in time, and maybe tomorrow I would choose some different ones. These are people that I think have really influenced the world, the piano world we live in, or have contributed a lot to it. The other caveat I'll say is that uh, I don't really want to talk about the very well known ones, but there are, like I said,
Like
50,
the
60
Glenn
years ago.
Goulds of the world.
Yeah, I do want to talk about living pianists, first of
Yeah.
all. So there are some great ones that have passed away, like Glenn Gould, like Rubinstein, like Horowitz, that I'm just not going to mention. And I wanted to just talk about living pianists and hopefully active pianists, because a couple of the ones on the list from the early times are not really performing anymore.
Right.
But the other thing is, to me, okay, so I'll go through some levels of maybe who knows whom. The general population today, I don't even think knows one famous pianist. Like if you went on the street and said, name a famous pianist, they might name Alicia Keys or
Right.
Billy Joel. And, I'd name those two because those two actually have what is called a classical training today, and which is so weird for me. It's like either you've been trained to play piano well or you haven't. But they both, I think Alicia Keys even studied or took some classes at Juilliard. I mean, she doesn't have a piano performance degree from Juilliard, nor does Billy Joel, but they took classes, both of them, at a reputable conservatory, and they had lessons throughout their childhood. So, they can really play piano, but only really to a certain level, like that local kind of your block level. And so most people in the world would just know those names. They wouldn't know the Horowitzes of today or even of yesteryear, of yesterday. They might not know any of the names today. And then you've got sort of that next level of musicians, but they're not pianists. And so there are musicians that are not pianists that might know one or two names, and that's about it. And maybe not even. I think the non-pianist musicians are pretty similar to the non-musicians in terms of what famous people they might be following because they're involved with their instrument and their art and just don't have space in their brain to put pianist name in there. And then you get pianists, and I think there are two categories of pianists. There are those that, I'm talking about people that really study and maybe are going to conservatory or university and studying music and piano. There are those that do their own art. They might know a couple famous names that they've heard in concert, or maybe they have a few CDs of so-and-so, or they know their teachers and their teachers' teachers, those kinds of things. And then there are pianophiles, people that just love piano, love to know all about it, all aspects of it, including the history and the people that came before them and how it's all spread out. And I'm a true pianophile. And so I tend to know a lot of names, and I maybe more than I need to. I don't always think that's a healthy obsession, but I do follow a lot of that. So
with that, let's go ahead and take a quick pause, and we'll continue this on the next podcast with Elias. Elias, thanks so much. This is Mike Levitt, and you've been listening to And If Love Remains.